I'm going to start with something a little bit different today. I think this is important. I think this is a good way to get some insight into some of the really like the worst talking points and the worst propaganda right now being spread by some on the right. I think disappointment, something really disappointing happened on Tuesday on the Joe Rogan podcast. Dan Crenshaw took Joe Rogan for a ride. I don't know how else to say it. Dan Crenshaw is a Republican congressman, and he is increasingly in favor with Trumpists. He came to prominence, sort of fell into favor with Donald Trump when he defended Donald Trump's handling of coronavirus, which is, I mean, I can't imagine a bigger failure for Trump than coronavirus, a global embarrassment. And Dan Crenshaw came to the forefront saying, look at how great of a job, actually, Donald Trump has done on this issue. And sadly, Joe Rogan got taken for a ride by Dan Crenshaw's slick but wrong claims about all sorts of different things. And the reason I'm saying that Crenshaw takes Joe Rogan for a ride is that it seems pretty clear that Dan Crenshaw knows that he's BSing. Dan Crenshaw knows that when he tells these lies, these are lies. He's not ignorant. He is smart enough to know that he's saying untrue things. And some of them he gets past Joe Rogan. Some of them Joe's kind of BS meter goes off and he says, hold on a second, does that make sense or doesn't it make sense? But there's this sort of cult of personality that's developed around Dan Crenshaw as if he's some epic truth teller of conservative truths that are irrefutable. But really, Dan Crenshaw, it's sort of Ben Shapiro-like with a lower pitched voice. He says things that are wrong. Lower pitched voice and slower speaking cadence. Dan Crenshaw, like Ben Shapiro, says things that are wrong, but says them confidently. And oftentimes people don't challenge him. So let's jump in. Thanks to Scott, one of our viewers, for sending me some of the notable moments from this interview. Here is one moment on the topic of Medicaid. To his credit, Joe Rogan's BS meter does go off here, but Crenshaw's mildly prepared. So let's take a look at it and then discuss.
Yeah. So instead of spending all this money on Medicaid, for instance, take the people who are eligible for Medicaid and even above that, right? And you could have a tiered program. Instead of wasting all that money on a Medicaid program that doesn't have improved outcomes, by the way, every study shows this.
What do you mean by that? It doesn't have improved outcomes?
It means that when you compare people from the same socioeconomic status and they're in Medicaid enrolled or they have no insurance at all, their health outcomes are no different. So again,
is that malarkey? Is that fucking around with statistics?
It's a lot of studies have shown this.
But hold on a second. You're talking about someone getting medical care or not getting medical care.
No. They still, because you always get medical care.
Okay, so the claim is, if you're going to do this, you first have to be really clear as to what the claim that's being made is. The claim being made by Dan Crenshaw is that people with Medicaid do no better in terms of health outcomes than people with no insurance, assuming they're of the same socioeconomic status. So 2 people who earn $22,000 a year, one has Medicaid, one has no insurance. Dan Crenshaw says they have the exact same health outcomes because, as he says, people with no insurance can still get care by going to the emergency room and not paying their bill, or by going to a doctor and not paying their bill, or whatever. So Medicaid really does nothing, but it costs money. Medicaid is bad in that sense. Dan Crenshaw cites that there's lots of studies that say this. Research this, and you will very quickly figure out where this comes from. This claim that people do no better on Medicaid than without insurance, given the same socioeconomic level, all goes back to one study called the Oregon Health Insurance Experiment. This is from 2013. This is like, this is meat, right? You need to understand this stuff to understand these talking points they come up with. This is a 2013 study, and it looked in Oregon and said what happened when Oregon did the Obamacare Medicaid expansion, and a bunch of people who previously didn't have health insurance got Medicaid, and then we followed some of that people. Now, some of those people. It's true. The study claims that, quote, this randomized controlled study showed Medicaid coverage generated no significant improvements in physical health outcomes in the first 2 years, but it did increase use of healthcare services, raised rates of detecting diabetes and managing diabetes, lowered rates of depression, and reduced financial strain. So let's analyze each finding individually. The main important one that is at issue with Dan Crenshaw is the people who got the Medicaid coverage generated no significant improvement in measured health outcomes in the first 2 years. But when you look at the details, you very quickly realize that this is an almost meaningless claim. How did they measure health outcomes? They looked only at 3 factors and only for 2 years. The 3 factors that were used were blood pressure, cholesterol, and what's called glycated hemoglobin levels, which measure diabetic blood sugar. And they tracked just those 3 indicators for 2 years. Now, I hope that it's becoming clear how slippery that is. Any other improvements, eliminating pain, treating infections sooner, lowering BMI, none of that is there. All they looked at is blood pressure, cholesterol, and glycated hemoglobin levels. These aren't even close to the most common reasons people go to doctors. The most common reasons that people go to doctors are skin issues of various kinds, joint pain and arthritis pain, back pain, respiratory issues, including colds that start to affect respiration, flu, bronchitis, pneumonia, COPD, emphysema, anxiety and depression, neurological issues, headaches and migraines. And yes, you also have on that top 12 list towards the bottom, cholesterol and blood pressure. So the study that Dan Crenshaw is talking about, he may not even know what his talking point, that his talking point is actually based on this study. It didn't measure anything about changes or outcomes related to 10 of the top 12 reasons people go to the doctor. It's meaningless in this context. And by the way, it only looked at 2 years. Many of these things, unfortunately, take longer for people to successfully treat and improve upon. So when he says the people on Medicaid don't do any better, measured only by looking at cholesterol, blood pressure, and diabetic blood sugar, doesn't make sense. Very incomplete. And by the way, the study also found that when people got Medicaid after not having it, and you compare the 2 groups, they were detecting that they were diabetic or pre-diabetic. They were managing that at a higher rate. Depression rates went down and financial strain went down, which is a good thing. So it's a complete and total gaslight. Dan Crenshaw is spouting something that is almost completely meaningless. It's wrong. It's the opposite of the truth. And Crenshaw is really pernicious, specifically because he sounds so normal and calm and confident and knowledgeable when he says things that are totally wrong. Compared to, for example, like when you hear Madison Cawthorn speak, he doesn't inspire confidence. When you hear Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert, not only are they saying things that are wrong, they sound totally not credible. When Dan Crenshaw says things that are wrong, he actually sounds credible. Let's look at another example.
And this was something that came out, like, whenever someone says, I want to make a list of people, like, hey.
It's a little like fascism.
Yeah, you're getting dangerous here. This is a weird thing you're doing.
The biggest lie of this century is that there's this like American right-wing fascism. The only fascism I see is, well, I mean, the most blatant example is the Antifa crazies who deliberately engage in fascist tactics to implement their little form of utopia. But also, like what we're talking about in Georgia, all these woke corporations engaging in what they're engaging in, this is fascism, this forced conformity.
Yes.
Like, and fascism, there's lots of kind of definitions.
Look at Dan Crenshaw claim that everybody else is misstating what fascism is, that some say fascism is only Hitler. And he'll tell you what the real fascism is. And he says corporations expressing an opinion about a law they don't like is fascism. When Coca-Cola criticizes the Georgia voting law or says MLB says we're not going to do business with Georgia, Dan Crenshaw wants you to believe that that's fascism. And he liked this talking point so much that he used it last night on Fox News as well. We won't go to that. Dan Crenshaw, much like Donald Trump used to say, wants you to believe everybody else is lying to you about what things are. I will tell you the truth, but then he lies to you. He says all of these other people are saying that this is fascism, that's fascism. No. The real fascism is Antifa, which is an anti-fascist group, and corporations criticizing Georgia. That's fascism. Fascism is when a system of government or a movement or a regime puts nation and sometimes race above the individual and has centralized, autocratic, authoritarian government, often headed by a dictator, with severe economic and social regimentation and forcible suppression of the opposition. When a for-profit corporation is free to say, we don't like this law, we might leave Georgia, and citizens are free to say, oh, I like that idea, I'm going to support Coca-Cola, for example, or I don't like what Coke is doing, I'm not going to support them, I'm going to boycott them. That's not fascism. That's free market economy. That's it. That's all it is. But people fall for this stuff because he sounds so confident when he says it. Here's another whopper that we've dealt with before on immigration.
So you think that most of the people that are progressive that look at this immigration issue and are more liberal and they're more open to this idea of open borders, the reason why they're doing it is because they're kind of compassionate, but they haven't looked at the actual statistics of what this means and what happens and why and what's the incentive? Is that what you believe?
That would be a kind way.
A kind way.
It depends on the person.
What's the unkind way?
You want more illegal immigration because you want them to eventually become citizens and vote for you.
Right.
So I think at the higher ends of the Democratic patriarchy.
So Joe Rogan says, right, like that makes obvious sense. Democrats want more immigrants because the immigrants will eventually become citizens, vote for Democrats, and so Democrats will win. First of all, it's actually unclear whether more immigrants becoming citizens really means a substantively impactful majority of Democrats over Republicans. Certainly Latin American immigrants other than Cubans and even some Venezuelans who in sort of like an anti-Maduro, anti-Castro reaction, Cubans and some Venezuelans tend to be sort of more to the right. Other than that, Latin American immigrants certainly lean left. But the Cato Institute, which is a right-wing think tank, researched this, and they said the question of whether immigrants are really more left or more right is a complicated question with lots of moving parts. The point is, even if immigrants skew left 55 to 45 or even 60-40, that margin, this is a really long play. This is a stupid way to try to win elections because for every 100,000 immigrants who after 5+ years, remember, you come to the U.S. with a green card. Takes a while to get the green card. You need to be in the country 5 years before you can apply for citizenship. Getting citizenship can take 1 to 2 more years. That's like 7 to 8 years for what, a 60-40 margin? After 7 years, for every 100,000 new citizens, if it's 60-40, you're only netting 20,000 voters, right? This is a very stupid way to try to win elections. And it's sort of like when the right says, oh, Democrats are trying to win by having people vote twice, like drive to one polling place and vote, and then drive to another polling place and vote under a different name or whatever. Do you understand how much work that is to try to actually swing an election? And much the same way, waiting around 7 years for like what's maybe a 55-45 or 60-40 margin on new citizens that are naturalized voting for it's incredibly stupid. So you really have to be political parties are barely able to plan ahead 2 years. And Dan Crenshaw wants you to believe that Democrats on what is really a small margin of Democrats over Republicans in terms of naturalized citizens are planning 7 to 8 years in advance as a strategy to win elections. It doesn't even pass the sniff test when you think about it. And again, unfortunately, because Dan Crenshaw says it so confidently, people fall for it. And if Joe Rogan is going for it, at least partially, you know that many in his audience are. So I could go on and on, a dozen such examples. Dan Crenshaw totally taking Joe Rogan for a ride with easily debunkable nonsense. And increasingly, Dan Crenshaw is becoming a hero of the right wing. It's sad, but it's also dangerous because these bad ideas spread and they get repeated with almost no critical thinking applied to them whatsoever. Let me know your thoughts, in particular if you saw this episode. You can find me on Twitter at @DPACman. One of our sponsors is privacy.com. They're giving you $5 when you sign up for their completely free service at privacy.com/Pacman. I've been using Privacy for a little over a year now. You've heard me talk about it before. It's a lifesaver, and here's how it works. Takes just a couple of minutes to set up. Anytime you buy something online or on the phone, instead of actually using your real credit card number, the Privacy app and the browser plugin let you give each company a randomized virtual credit card number that you create out of thin air. It'll even autofill the card number with one click. And the payment is taken out of your checking account without the merchant ever knowing your real information. So this allows you to keep your banking information secure, but also to take control of your finances. You can create up to 12 of these virtual credit cards a month. You can set spending limits. You can freeze them. You can delete them anytime you want. So when you do this, it means you're not going to be charged when you don't want to be, because you can destroy the virtual card number right after using it, which, for instance, I love using free trials because I know I won't be charged when the trial is over if I use a virtual credit card number. You're keeping your identity private by not telling companies who you are. You're keeping your bank or credit card info protected against data breaches and identity theft. And it's free. And like I said, you'll get $5 to spend when you sign up at privacy.com/Pacman.